Well, good morning. It's good to see you here. Those of you who are here on campus and those of you who are visiting via live stream. As Dr. Pratt mentioned, the title of my paper is Revisiting Romans 11:26. That means I'm visiting it again, okay? I started writing on this topic in the spring of 1998 as a PhD student. And then I published my first essay, which was from that seminar, in December of 2000 in JETS, called Romans 11 and the Future of Ethnic Israel. More than a decade and a half later, I was asked to contribute to a 3 views book on the same topic. See, once you start writing on these things, they never leave you. My chapter was titled, A Typological Non-Future Mass Conversion View. It was published in the book 3 Views on Israel and the Church, Perspectives on Romans 9 to 11, Kriegel, 2018. My purpose here is to summarize my position. I've already written on it, but I'm going to give you 10 reasons why I still believe this position. But first, allow me to briefly state my position in relation to other positions. So there are basically 3 main positions, 3 main views. The first is the future mass conversion view. That says, when Paul says in Romans 11:26, and so all Israel will be saved, it means in the future, probably just related to just before the return of Christ, there'll be a mass conversion of ethnic Jews. The second position states that when Paul says Israel, what he really means is Jews and Gentiles, that is, the church. The third view, the one I'm going to argue for, is that Paul is referring to ethnic Jews throughout history. So in other words, my view is that all Israel represents the view that the elect of ethnic Israel throughout history, those are the ones who, as Paul is referring to when he says all Israel will be saved. That is, he's not predicting a future time when the majority of ethnic Jews will embrace Jesus as the Messiah and be saved. Instead, Paul's point is this, that God will never completely forsake the nation of Israel, but that there will always be a remnant of believing Jews throughout history. Israel will experience only a partial hardening until the end of time, that is, until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. In other words, they will never be fully hardened and rejected from the salvation offered in the Messiah. Thus, it's the sum total of all the elect remnant throughout history that represents the salvation of all Israel. Although not a majority view, there continues to be a growing remnant who embrace this position. You might look at it as sort of like the Minority Report. Remember that movie with Tom Cruise? That report was correct, right? The Minority Report. So I offer to you the Minority Report. So 10 reasons why I still hold this view. So this is going to be like skipping a rock across the pond, okay? I'm going to do it in the remaining 26 minutes that I have. Number 1, Romans 9 to 11 should be taken as a consistent and coherent whole. All acknowledge that Romans 9 to 11 forms a unit in Paul's thought. Therefore, any interpretation of Romans 11 must be consistent with Romans 9 and 10. Whether these 3 chapters function as an excursus, a climax, or as I prefer, an integral step in Paul's argument, it is crucial to honor the unity and consistency of this passage. Well, at the end of Romans 8, Paul unequivocally affirms God's sovereignty and benevolence in the life of the believer, right? What can separate you from the love of Christ? But all these grandiose promises are called into question if God is not able or willing to deliver on them. Andrew Doss rightly identifies a problem, quote, if God is so faithful to the elect in Christ, of what value is God's prior election to ethnic Israel? Were not all these blessings originally Israel's? How can Christians find solace in their special place of election by God when God's historic people are not benefiting from their blessings. And that's the dilemma. Thus, beginning in chapter 9, Paul addresses the question of God's faithfulness to his promises. If God made promises to the people of Israel but did not deliver on those promises, what kind of assurance do believers have? Romans 9 to 11 then vindicates God's righteousness and faithfulness regarding his covenantal promises to Israel. And so I agree with Scott Haferman that God's righteousness is the central theme in Romans 9 to 11. Paul's answer to the question of God's faithfulness should be seen as consistently answered in the entire passage. So that's number one. Number two, Romans 9 to 11 consistently refers to ethnic Jews. I have no problem with a typological correlation between Israel and the church. In fact, I believe that Gentile Christians are included in Paul's reference to the Israel of God in Galatians 6:16. So theologically, I don't have a problem with that. Or I think that the 144,000 from the 12 tribes of Israel referenced in Revelation 7 and 14 are symbolic of the church. I don't have a theological problem with that. But I don't think that's what Paul's doing here in this passage. And so I want to distinguish my view from the view of others such as Calvin, N.T. Wright, and others who maintain that all Israel refers to all of God's people, Jews and Gentiles. I disagree with them that when Paul states that in this way all Israel will be saved, he's offering, as N.T. Wright states, a polemical redefinition of the term so that Israel also includes believing Gentiles or the church. Disagree with that view. In Romans 9 to 11, the term Israel is used 11 times. The term Israelites is used twice. And in every time, it seems to me, and the majority of scholars, that it's referring to ethnic Israel. Furthermore, Paul wishes he could be accursed for the sake of his brothers, his kinsmen according to the flesh. Later on in chapter 11, Israel is beloved for the sake of their forefathers. So the entire purpose of Paul's discussion centers on the fate of his fellow Jews. And so it would be altogether unexpected at the end of Romans 9 to 11 for Paul to introduce the same term with a different referent. And so I think the context argues against that view. Number three, and this one's probably the most important out of all of them, so if you're paying attention, pay particular attention to this one. Romans 9 to 11 paradigmatically uses 9:6 and the concept of two Israels. There are two different Israels, but I don't think one is ethnic Israel, one's the church. There's ethnic Israel as a whole, and then there's a remnant within that group. You see, correctly understanding the meaning of 9:6 is the key. God is not unfaithful to his promises to Israel regarding their salvation. Why? Why is God not unfaithful? Because he says, for not all Israel is Israel. God never promised to save the nation as such. That is, not every physical Israelite receives God's promise. Paul uses the term Israel with two different yet overlapping references. The first group refers to physical Israelites. I call this Israel 1. Whereas the second group denotes a smaller subgroup, still Israelites, but those who are the elect remnant, the children of the promise. You see, God never promised Abraham that all of his descendants would be saved based on their ethnic identity. True Israel consists of those who are children of the promise, not the children of the flesh. God never promised every individual Jew that they would be saved, but those who are unconditionally elected within ethnic Israel. In Isaac, not in Ishmael, Abraham's descendants were named, and it was Jacob, not Esau, in whom the covenant promises were to be fulfilled. You see, God is not unfaithful to his promises. Why? Because God never promised to save every ethnic Jew, but only an elect remnant. Charles Horn puts it this way. If Paul is speaking in 11:26 of a future mass conversion of the nation of Israel, then he is destroying the entire development of his argument in chapters 9 through 11. For the one important point that he is trying to establish constantly is exactly this, that God's promises attain fulfillment not in the nation as such, that is, all of ethnic Israel, but rather in the remnant according to the election of grace. You see this pattern then, this Israel within an Israel. You see it elsewhere. So I move to 11:7. And so chapter 11, verse 7, Paul uses different terms, but he makes the same division. He says, the elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. You see, those who are described as the rest represent the majority, Israel 1, whereas the elect represent the faithful remnant, Israel 2. Or go to 11:25 and 26. The same pattern is found. Paul says, a partial hardening has come upon Israel, and in this way all Israel will be saved. Some, however, are convinced that it is not probable that Paul uses Israel with two different references in the space of two verses, space of two sentences. But there is no reason why Paul could not shift meaning, especially when we consider 9:6 to be the key to an understanding 9 to 11. In the same sentence, Paul uses Israel with two different references. Not all Israel is Israel. He set the paradigm in 9:6. N.T. Wright puts it this way. It is impermissible to argue that Israel cannot change its referent within the space of two verses, so that Israel in verse 25 must mean the same as Israel in 26. Paul actually began the whole section, 9:6, with just a programmatic distinction of the two Israels. Don't forget about that when you get to chapter 11. Number 4, Romans 9 to 11 declares that Israel stumbled but did not fall. Paul opens chapter 11 with a question, has God rejected his people? The answer to this is me genoito. No, may it never be. This question in no way anticipates a future restoration of Israel. Paul's not thinking about the future. He's asking, has God rejected Israel? Are they totally out? And his answer is no. God has not totally rejected his people because God always has an elect remnant, even when it appears that all have forsaken him. And so he uses himself and Elijah as examples. Then in verse 11 of chapter 11, Paul rephrases the question. I think it's essentially the same question. He says, so I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? Did they stumble so as to fall? And his answer is the same. By no means. Again, this question doesn't presuppose a reversal of Israel's fortune or future. Paul is asking if they are completely and utterly rejected. Some wrongly read verse 11 as if Israel has fallen now, but that their fallen state is only temporary, not permanent. One author puts it this way, quote, Paul's emphatic, may it never be, emphatically reveals that Israel's stumbling is not a permanent fall. A reversal is coming. Another writes, Israel has fallen, but not forever. Israel has fallen? Did they not read verse 11? Israel has not fallen. They stumbled, but they did not fall. Paul clearly and emphatically states that Israel has not fallen. Did they stumble so as to fall? May it never be. They did stumble, but their stumbling did not result in them falling. Although the majority of Israel has stumbled and has not embraced God's Messiah, they did not fall from God's saving purposes. Paul's asking whether Israel is completely out, and the answer he himself provides is absolutely not. They are not out of the race. God has not completely rejected them. There is no hint of a reversal of Israel's fortune, since Paul's answer is that they did not fall. Number 5. Romans 9-11 is speaking primarily about Paul's present, not the future. It's interesting how the future kind of gets added, like we add that, we bring that to the text. But the present is really what's being focused on. In verse 1 of chapter 11, Paul asks the question, has God rejected? No, I'm an Israelite. Look at me. God has not rejected me. He's using himself as an answer to the question. You go to verse 5, chapter 11. Paul says, so too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. And Paul illustrates this with the time of Elijah. Elijah felt the same way, that there were none who believed, and God reserved 7,000. And so Paul uses himself, he uses Elijah to show that at the present time, there is a remnant. We go on, verses 13 and 14. Paul talks about how his ministry supports this idea of a present context. It's Paul's own ministry. He says in verse 13, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I'm an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order that somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus to save some of them. You see, the principle that a remnant will remain throughout every age is the basis for Paul's hope that some would be saved during his ministry. And then finally, I would point to verses 30 and 31, where you have this threefold use of now. He says, the Gentiles now receive mercy, whereas Israel now is disobedient, although some of Israel now receives mercy. So the focus isn't the future as much as it is on the present. Number 6, Romans 9-11 does not imply a reversal of Israel's fate. And again, I think this is sometimes brought to the text. If there are a few verses that maybe support this idea, usually verses 12 and 15 are the key texts for this. So let's look at those. Paul states in verse 12 of chapter 11, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if they, speaking of Israel, if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? And then verse 15, if their, Israel's, if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? You see, those who interpret 11:26 as referring to a future mass conversion of ethnic Israel state that Israel's trespass, failure, rejection, that's the present time, whereas their full inclusion and acceptance, that's a time yet to come. So currently Israel's rejecting Christ, but the time will come when they accept Christ and will be saved. But the above interpretation is not without its difficulties. Let me point out 3 things. First, it is often assumed that Paul is speaking temporally. So Israel's trespass, failure, rejection is now, but their acceptance is in the future. Instead, I would propose that we understand Paul's statement to coincide with Romans 9:6 and the paradigmatic use of the two Israels. Israel 1 is rejecting now, but Israel 2 is accepting now, so that they're both now. Second, I'm a little suspicious about the translation of the ESV that I cited above. It translates pleroma as full inclusion instead of fullness. I think that's a little bit biased, and it's not translated that way in verse 25 when it's used. Third, there's no clear evidence in the passage that fullness refers to a future event it is future, but when Israel turns again to their God. One clue to the meaning of fullness is found in verse 25, as I just mentioned, where Paul talks about the fullness of the Gentiles. he talks about when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. Every scholar that I read affirms that the fullness of the Gentiles is the elect of the Gentiles throughout history. So I would submit, what about the fullness of Israel is the elect of Israel throughout history? Colin Cruz puts it this way: in light of the use of fullness in respect to the Gentiles in 1125, we are justified in concluding that Israel's full inclusion means the full number of believing Jews, which will be made up when those yet to believe are added to the remnant that already believe. Number 7, Romans 9-11 does not promise a future ingrafting of the nation of Israel. Again, this is one of the ones that's kind of assumed, misread perhaps. But Paul states in 11:23 that even if they, speaking of Israel, I would say this is Israel too, those who believe, or those who will believe, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. People look at that and say, hey, that's a prophecy. They will be grafted in. But read again a little bit closer. That's not what Paul says. First of all, the primary purpose of Paul giving this illustration is to warn the Gentiles of pride, not to boast. They're not the natural branches. But second, nowhere does Paul state or imply that God is going to graft all of unbelieving Jews back into the tree. Rather, he states that those who believe will be grafted in. In fact, Paul uses what's called a conditional sentence. A conditional sentence has conditions. If they believe, they will be grafted in. That's not a prophecy or a prediction. It's a conditional statement. Will Jews have genuine faith in Jesus the Messiah? Yes, they will be grafted in. Number 8. Romans 9-11 demonstrates a redemptive historical relationship between Jews and Gentiles. Now, those who reject my position often state that the mystery that Paul's referring to is no longer a mystery if it's simply the elect of ethnic Israel being saved throughout history. What's mysterious about that? But I would respond by saying it's not simply that all Israel will be saved, but it's the manner. Paul says, and this way, and this manner, all Israel will be saved. And I think the manner involves the interdependence between the salvation of Gentiles and Israel, Jews and Gentiles. Ritterboss explains the mystery this way. He says it involves, quote, the strange interdependence of the salvation of Israel and that of the Gentiles. God grants no mercy to Israel without the Gentiles, but neither does he do so to the Gentiles without Israel. And then let me address 2 other questions related to verse 25. First is, what does Paul mean by partial hardening? And again, this is misunderstood to think that Paul's saying is right now, all of Israel is hardened. They're partially hardened. But in the future, that will come, God will remove the hardening. There'll be a reversal. No, that's not what the text says, I don't think. By partial hardening, Paul doesn't mean that all Israel is partially hardened, but that some of Israel is hardened and some of Israel is not hardened. If you go back to verse 7 of chapter 11, you see this paradigm. He says, the elect of Israel obtained salvation, the rest were hardened. So there's some of Israel that aren't hardened, the elect remnant. And so what Paul is saying is that some Israel is not fully hardened, some of Israel is not. The elect remnant within this larger group is not hardened. The second issue relates to the meaning of until. He says this will take place until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Those who affirm a future mass conversion of Jews interpret this phrase to mean that Israel is currently hardened, but their hardening status will change when God shifts from saving Gentiles to Jews. But is that the most natural way to read the word until? Well, this word, or in Greek, it's actually two words, is essentially terminative, ending. It ends, right? It shows an ending of some kind in its significance. Yet the context will determine where the emphasis lies after the termination. So oftentimes the phrase is used in an eschatological context where the termination often implies eschatological fulfillment as opposed to an eschatological reversal. So think about that. I'll give you a couple examples of eschatological fulfillment instead of reversal. From Paul in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 11:26, Paul states that the church is to partake of the Lord's Supper until, and proclaim his death until he comes. Same word, same phrase. But Paul's purpose is not to stress that one day the church will not celebrate the Lord's Supper, but instead his point is that it will celebrate the Lord's Supper until the end of time, not a reversal, eschatological fulfillment. Or 1 Corinthians 15:25, Paul states that Christ must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The intended stress is not a time when Christ will no longer reign, but that he must continue to reign until the last enemy is conquered at the final judgment, eschatological termination, not reversal. There's not a time when he's not reigning. It's not flipped upside down, so to speak. So, likewise, the partial hardening of Israel will occur until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, until the end. Paul is not suggesting a time when the hardening will be reversed, but a time when the hardening will be eschatologically fulfilled. Number 9. Romans 9-11 demonstrates that the mystery does not include a future mass conversion. And so here now we're looking at specifically and briefly at verse 26, where Paul says, "And in this way all Israel will be saved." What is the meaning of the word hautos, in this, translated in this way or in this manner? Well, scholars note that it probably doesn't have a temporal meaning. It's not "and then." He's not talking temporally or logically, but it's what's called the modal use. And in this way, in this manner. Manner comes from the context. Well, some would argue that the context supports a temporal reference. Even if it doesn't mean something temporally, the context supports a temporal understanding. I don't see that in the context, and because of time, I'm gonna press on. But what's interesting is that a future mass conversion of Israel is completely absent, not only from the rest of Paul's writing, but from the rest of the New Testament. This would be the only place that you have this. A matter of fact, Doug Moo, who disagrees with my view, or I could put it, I disagree with his view, he states that Paul's teaching about a final ingathering of Jewish people has no parallel elsewhere in his writings. Number 10. Romans 9-11 focuses on the first coming, not the second coming of Christ. You see, after Paul quotes, "and in this way all Israel will be saved," he quotes, there's actually a couple of citations from Isaiah 59 and Isaiah 27, where it says, "The deliverer will come from Zion, he will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins." And so those who hold a future mass conversion view say, this is the second coming. Jesus will take away the sins of Israel. Some would even point that it says the deliverer will come from Zion. It's future. And my response is, it's future when Isaiah wrote it. But I don't think Paul is quoting it because he thinks it's future, because the deliverer has already come from Zion. And it doesn't say the deliverer will come from heaven. It says he will come from Zion. And so I, along with other scholars, affirm that this is referring to, or insist that this is referring to the first coming of Christ, not the second coming of Christ. For example, Andrew Doss says this. He says, "Nowhere in Romans 11 does Paul connect the salvation of all Israel to Christ's parousia or second coming. Paul does not even refer to the parousia of Christ in Romans 9 to 11. In 11:26 to 27, he certainly speaks of a deliverer who will come from or out of Zion. But for Paul, these prophecies have already been fulfilled. Christ came from Zion as the Jewish Messiah. God has already placed in Zion a stumbling stone. The prophecies Paul cites in 11:26 to 27 were therefore fulfilled in Christ's first coming, end quote. So to conclude, Romans 9 to 11 not teach or imply a future mass conversion, but that there will always be a remnant of believing Jews throughout history. God has not rejected or forsaken Israel. They have not fallen, but God never promised to save all the nation as a whole, but those who are the children of promise. Whenever individual Jews believe in the Messiah, they are grafted back into the olive tree of salvation. But God's salvation of Israel is connected to the salvation of the Gentiles. And this is the mystery, that God has not forsaken Israel, since only part of them is hardened, until the last Gentile has been saved. And that is how all Israel will be saved. Thank you.